What's going on, everyone? So a lot of the times we've got lists for best rares, best legendaries, but not often the best uncommons. I know a lot of people in my Discord over on Patreon actually wanted to see a full list of the uncommons. And although that would be fun, there's a lot of stinkers in here. There's also a lot more uncommons than there are rares and legendaries. So I figured let's do a top 10 because there are, as I said, a lot, but there's a few absolute gems. And in some cases, some cards that can be even more impacting on the game than the rares and legendaries. So with a big thank you to my patrons, as well as I have a TCG player link in the description down below, let's talk about the top 10 most broken uncommons in Star Wars Unlimited. And guys, where we're going to start off without Plo Koon being the number one on the list. I don't know if it's number one in terms of strength. I mean, there are certainly some cards on here that can do some more powerful things in certain circumstances, but Plo Koon definitely is up there as one of the best, if not uncommons, but just better cards in the entire game. Plo Koon absolutely changed cunning heroism for the worse in some people's eyes. Han Solo incorporated Plo Koon super easily, works perfectly kind of with what you want to do, right? With Han Solo coming down, getting an extra resource, you can kind of play Plo Koon or Han Solo on the same turn. So if Han Solo doesn't look good, then you can drop a Plo Koon, get the ambush out. And oftentimes this is ambushing as a 6/6. It is incredible. But more importantly, the deck that really takes this to another level is the Quinlan deck. Quinlan comes down same turn as Plo Koon, so again, helps you trigger that raid 3, which is very easy to trigger for the most part. But also, this can now deal 7 damage on ambush because of Quinlan, right? Anything that's 5 or less cost now takes the full 6 from Plo and another one from Quinlan. This can actually knock out some really tankier leaders, which is incredible. Of course, they'd have to cost 5 or less, which there are a few, not a ton of them, but this just in general can knock out all the 4/6 leaders that come down on 5. It just does some insane work. The really impactful part about this thing is that not only is it something that's the force tag, not only is it something that has as a 6/6 stat line on attacks for the most part, but the fact that it can get immediate value. That's the tricky part about these 5+ resource plays when you're in a more aggressive deck, and Cunning Heroism tends to be. But the disruption that this offers is really where its strength is. When you're playing Quinlan or Han and you're curving like Bodhi's into Kira's into Plo Koons, your opponent's hand is devastated, their board is devastated, everything's exhausted, and they just cannot recover. And that's the key with Plo Koon. This was a card where when it came out, I was like, this guy looks pretty good. I can imagine just a 3/6 ambusher being decent already. But the fact that you can get the 6/6 stat line with the raid 3 frequently because of the way these decks shaped up to look like, it just became like a mainstay in so many Cunning Heroism decks. But now we get to talk about a set 4 card in Director Krennic. This card on its own has pushed Gar, Saxon Yellow to one of those tier 1 style of decks, a deck that's really tough to contend with, and one of the decks that actually was able to push Django back, which was crazy to see. But if you just think about this, on a baseline, what we were playing all the time with more aggressive decks was Crafty Smuggler, just a 2/2 shielded. This is that, but then you add an insane ability attached to it, which is a resource discount going forward on any when defeated abilities that you have. Now, this is not something that you have to index towards very hard, okay? When you're playing something like, let's say Gar Yellow is a perfect example where Director Krennic fits in perfectly. You play this, you can curve into your 3/4 shielded with Gar Sax that costs 4, but now it costs 3. Right? So now it's a 3/4 space heater with shielded, which is incredibly above rate. Then you can do things like Ruthless Raider comes down a turn earlier in other decks, or in another situation like Gar Saxon Yellow, oftentimes you play Inferno 4 or Greedo. So you can do something like Director Krennic plus Greedo turn 1, or Director Krennic plus, play a 3-drop or a 2-drop plus an Inferno 4 alongside it. So you get to do 2 2-drops on turn 2. That's the type of stuff. Just this random extra value while playing a 2/2 shielded, which was already good enough, is incredible. And then you have decks that can completely just take Krennic and absolutely break it, like Thrawn, right? Definitely not a consistent thing to do, but something that can absolutely turn into some of the most powerful turns in the entire game, where you're able to absolutely curve into multiple when defeated things over and over and over again, and then they chain off with Thrawn, you get to double them up, and then suddenly things go absolutely nuts. Now, that's not necessarily specifically Director Krennic's, doing, but the thing that Dark Lord Krennic is doing is being able to actually do that way sooner because of the 1 resource discount. And it may not seem like a lot, but again, when you consider things like Han Solo, set 2 Han Solo, or even the set 1 Han Solo, where you're cheating on resources, you can tell how powerful these types of abilities are. Or even Piet, where you're able to cheat on capital ships. Any sort of resource discount, especially when you can play it on turn 1, and it's tanky because it's shielded, and it has a reasonable stat line that's comparable to other like cards that people are playing. You got to take a double look at this card and really determine whether or not you want to index towards it. Again, this is a card that I am very much expecting to get even better going forward because of more when defeated abilities. With the expectation that they're thinking of Thrawn and Krennic, I imagine this card's going to just get insanely better as more sets come on. And now we get to move on back to set 2 and talk about Cassian Andor. This is definitely a card where we were all kind of looking at, for the most part, like, yeah, I think this is going to be a card that you're probably going to want to fit in your Rebel decks, right? If you look back on set 2, before we had, a lot of things in the meta, we saw Sabine. And that was a major contender. It was like number 1, number 2 deck. And it was the Rebel deck. And we weren't seeing a ton of Rebels with set 2. Of course, we were looking at like the things like Wrecker, the things like Poe, and we're like, oh, these cards look like they're going to be amazing in Sabine, of course. But we weren't seeing those specific Rebel cards. So I was thinking, okay, Cassian, definitely Rebel, fits perfectly, probably going to be playing in Sabine. But more importantly, this just kind of gives you a little bit more value in the late game, which set 1 Sabine was actually really missing. For those of you that didn't play during set 1 or don't remember, set 1 Sabine was like topping out on 4 resources for the most part. You weren't really playing anything past that. If you were playing some of the more competitive set on Sabine decks. Of course, there are some decks that were, sideboarding U-Wing reinforcements or had, the Gorilla Walker in there, the 4/6 that gets to ready up immediately. But the strength of those cards were the fact that you got immediate value. And that's what Cassian was doing. The fact that you got to immediately ready up and get in damage past the point where your opponent was stabilizing. And that's where Cassian's come in play. This 5 resources, but more importantly, being able to resource him earlier and then use those 5 resources when you don't have anything else to do was extremely key, because Sabine would run out of steam. Now, that doesn't really happen all that often anymore, in that you can oftentimes have the Wreckers, the Poes, as I said, that can really push in more and more damage. But Cassian's still a mainstay in multiple heroism decks just because of the fact that you get an immediately readied up unit that can do something late on in the game as soon as you pay the resources. And as I said, with something like Plo Koon, the ability to do something immediately completely changed the dynamic of a card, because oftentimes the limitation of a lot of these decks is the fact that you cannot go ahead and do that. You cannot immediately take advantage of him. You have to wait that full round. So Cassian breaks that dynamic and is definitely one of the stronger uncommons in the game. To no one's a surprise, we've got Blue Leader here. Another set 4 card. This is a card that when it came out, it was one of the first spoiled cards in set 4, and everyone was like, yeah, this is just going to be a broken card. Like, it's just going to be good. And guess what? It's a pretty good card. Again, versatility and the ability to do something immediately is really what gives it its strength. It can come down early enough. We have a lot of A-Wings in the meta, things that can kind of just get immediately killed by it. So in this space, it can come down, kill your opponent's turn 1 play, and stay alive to put on pressure to your opponent. Amazing, absolutely amazing card. But then in the late game, when you got those 5 resources, you suddenly have this option, and you have a lot of options. You can do something like ambush space unit, kill a space unit, pay the 2, move it into the ground, and give the 2 experience tokens. You can not choose to do that, just pay for 3 resource, 3/3 ambusher if you want in the space. But then you could do the reverse, which is all in on the ground and have a 5/5 ambusher on the ground. And yes, a 5 resource 5/5 ambusher isn't like insane. It is good, but it's not insane. As we see with like Plo Koon, could be a 6/6, right? It could be a 6/6. But the versatility and the ability to determine when you need what you need at certain points in the game is what makes this card truly strong. And then at the end of it all, you get to tag on the Rebel tag. And guess what? That makes it an absolute beast in all sorts of decks. Things like Wing Leader, Fleet Lieutenant, things like your random Rebel synergies with Metal Ceremony if you're playing that. Just in general, the fact that you have a Rebel tag on this makes it so much more versatile. It improves its kind of versatility even more past what it was already doing, which is I could be a space ambusher, I could be a ground ambusher, but now you're a space ambusher and ground ambusher, but you also work with all the synergies that people were playing already in things like Sabine, for example. But I've also seen this like Luke Green. Yeah, I've seen this in decks that are just basically any command heroism deck, really, that has to contend space and wants more options in their deck. It is just an amazing unit. And now we get to talk about what might just be the best uncommon in the entire game, Force Throw. This is definitely one of my picks for best uncommons. It requires a little bit of setup. It does require a little bit of setup. And that's one of the things where, even though this was from set 1, we really didn't see it come into its own until set 3, set 4, when we started to see more force units from the prior sets. In set 1, this one was literally the namesake and created its entire archetype on its own just because of Force Throw. And that was the Cheer It Red deck. It was the best Force Throw deck. How many times have you seen on YouTube how many videos like, this is the best Force Throw deck, right? I mean, I've seen so many of those videos. Of course, right now it's probably Quinlan, and I would put it as Quinlan. And especially with the next set, I mean, Force Throw is just going to be an absolute disgusting card with how many force options you have. Like, every single deck is going to be playing Force Throw. This is so incredibly strong. For one resource, you can choose to basically kill anything on the board in most scenarios. You can discard your own cards to control how much damage you want to deal. And again, one resource to deal 6 to something is incredibly underrated and insanely powerful. But then you can also do the other thing, which is, oh, your opponent's got a little bit of damage on their unit. Anything that they discard is probably going to kill it. Well, suddenly you pay one resource, get a card out of your opponent's hand, and kill their unit for one resource. Of course, you have to have a force unit, but again, that's something that's really not that hard to accomplish these days. In earlier sets, it was like, oh, I've got to play Cheer It Blue, I've got to play, or Cheer It Red, I've got to play, the Kanan, I got to play the Yoda, I've got to play all these different cards to try to make it work. I got to play Cheer It because he's the early to deploy force leader. Nowadays, guess what? You got Quinlan, who deploys just as early as Cheer It, and he's super tanky with his 7 toughness. You've got your Anakin Skywalkers, which can be played on turn 1. You've got Grogu's, which is played on turn 1, which usually Grogu's not played, but Anakin definitely is. You've got things like Ezra. You've got things like Ahsoka. You've got things like Plo Koon. All those things all have the Force tag. All of it makes Force Throw work, and it is incredible. You've seen some games where you get double Force Throw and the game feels so unwinnable. And then there's other games where the game is completely losing, but then someone does a play where they go Plo Koon plus Force Throw in the same turn, and you're like, they just killed my best unit and got a 6/6 ambusher, so they killed my other best unit. It's just insane what this card can accomplish because of the cheapness of it, but then also the fact that you get to disrupt your opponent while doing so, and in some cases get to disrupt your opponent's hand and their board for just one resource. It's just I have no other words for it other than, if you've played against the Force decks, you know what I'm talking about. The next one we got to talk about on the list is Red 5. This is definitely the most, I would say, underrated card on the list. It is a card where people just kind of slap in their decks and like, yeah, it's pretty good. Like, I think it's good. But the dynamic of this really comes in the Rebel tag alongside the stat line of this card. It also works perfectly within some of the decks that are currently playing it, including something like Quinlan. One of the things that we really didn't have was this like 3 resource, 3/4 space unit in Rebel trait. We had like Red 5, which was a 2/3 Rebel unit. Obviously, it had a good effect, but realistically now, well, it had a good effect in the earliest sets. Now, I don't even think Red 5 is really a playable card or a Red 3 is a really playable card in most scenarios. Red 5, on the other hand, the stat line is really important. Again, it combos super well with what the decks that are playing Red 5 want to do, which is early disruption, early damage on some units. Quinlan, as I said numerous times, just makes this card absolutely absurd because you get to play it, and then oftentimes you'll have random damage here and there. You get to finish off units with this thing. Of course, just the 2 damage can be really important to make people discouraged from certain ambushes and things like that. But you also just have a 3/4 space unit, which is really, really important. It has the Rebel tag for things like Sabine. A lot of times people are playing Red 5 nowadays. Just because of the stat line, it's got the Rebel tag, and other decks outside of that, something like New Luke or even like Anakin, just getting in damage and then having this ability to deal 2 damage to random units is extremely powerful. It is something that at first glance, you're like, okay, yeah, this seems like a card I'd probably put in my deck. Like, it's probably just, a nice curve filler, nice solid stat line. And then you play it and you're like, oh, wow, this is actually more impressive than you initially think. And that's what really kind of impressed me with Red 5 early on. Now we get to a card that probably is the most broken on the list in terms of the sense of breaking natural game mechanics, and Lurking TIE Phantom. Nice little 2/2 space unit, but most importantly, it can't be captured, damaged, or defeated by enemy card abilities. That line in of itself is something that has really changed the landscape of a lot of things. This ability was an absolute nightmare in set 2, when we didn't have a ton of ways to deal with this guy. Now we have Perilous Position, which came out in set 3. We've got ways like No Glory on the Results to bypass it. We have answers that have been printed post TIE Phantom. But when this guy came out in set 2, it literally just completely dominated some of certain areas. Now, of course, Boba Fett was still a situation, but Boba Fett oftentimes played Lurking TIE Phantoms to get past their worst matchup, which was controlling decks. Boba Yellow was one of the worst matchups for Boba Yellow, was the controlling decks where you couldn't leverage Boba Fett's ability. Guess what? Lurking TIE Phantoms, boom, immediately gave you an advantage. It, in some situations, completely just dominated in terms of, okay, some decks, like Tarkin Yellow, for example, were playing Lurking TIE Phantom, would pump it up, and suddenly your opponent just couldn't deal with it, right? The only thing you could really do is exhaust it or bounce it, and not every deck was doing that, right? Because most of those are cunning. So if you're fighting cunning, yes, that was a thing you can do, but if you weren't, suddenly you're in trouble. And then other decks, like, as I said, Boba Yellow, were just kind of slotting it in, and in some cases just sideboarding it in to completely change the nature of some matchups. There's another card on this list that we're going to talk about that it completely blanks, and that's another card that's extremely powerful, and it just completely changed the game for a lot of decks. It had to be considered when you were creating your deck. How do I deal with Lurking TIE Phantom? If I don't have the answer to that, I may just lose on the spot. And of course, the card that Lurking TIE Phantom blanks, Power of the Dark Side. This one I honestly thought was a common for some reason, but as I was looking through the uncommons, I was like, oh yeah, Power of the Dark Side. That is an uncommon, true. This is kind of just one of the cards that made control possible, realistically. The ability to defeat any unit on turn 2, no matter what your opponent played on turn 1, was incredibly strong. This allowed you to stall out the game so significantly. The curve, especially when set 1 and set 2 were really controlling metas, the curve of having, okay, turn 1, they play a unit, maybe you would just play nothing. Like, honestly, you would just play nothing. You just take initiative or whatever. And then turn 2, you play Power of the Dark Side, kill their unit. They play a unit. Turn 3, you play Takedown, kill their unit. And then you just kind of keep up that. Was incredibly strong. Of course, now with Dr. Pershing or Bosks, you don't necessarily do that same curve, but Power of the Dark Side is almost always a full 3 of in all of those decks. And the reason that is because not only is it powerful in the early game to deal with a lot of that stuff, but also in the late game, you can really combo together a lot of removal or a lot of more expensive stuff with such a cheap event like Power of the Dark Side to finish things off. Something like, okay, I'm gonna go Super Laser Blast plus Power of the Dark Side. Like, clear the board, plus Power of the Dark Side to kill their unit, and now we're at stability, we're stabilized, and then I can follow it with my expensive stuff to really dominate the board. And the last thing that needs to be mentioned about Power of the Dark Side, and this is something that they decided to not include with a Merciless Contest, even though Merciless Contest defeats each player's unit, it's non-leader. And I think they did that on purpose because they didn't want to have a bunch of people running around with more cards that could defeat leaders for 3 resources. That is incredibly strong and is something that people have to keep in mind when fighting up against control decks or villainy vigilance in general. Is Power of the Dark Side can just knock out your leader in one go around. It is incredibly strong. Next up, we've got Ruthless Raider, and this is a card that definitely was a strong card to deal with across all sets. The ability to essentially have 4 guaranteed damage to an enemy base is extremely strong. And of course, without Triple Dark Raid, this is a card that's gone a lot further down, but I wanted to include it on the list, even though it's not going to be played nearly as much because Triple Dark Raid was one of the main reasons as to why it was so powerful. It still is a card that people play very frequently in a lot of their decks. And again, it's because you play this big space unit. It's something your opponent kind of has to deal with. And in the process of dealing with it, you just get guaranteed value. And that is something that is really important. I've talked a lot about it with Plo Koon and with Cassian, but you want to get something with immediate value when you get to the mid to late game. You cannot be playing these super expensive things that don't do something when they come down, because they're too expensive to get blown out by something like a waylay or just a removal option. So if that's going to happen, you need to get value when it comes down. And also, if there is a situation where you need to attack with it, there's a lot of situations where it'll just get exhausted or bounced or whatever it is, or your opponent will be able to do something before you can do something, to where they get their value before your thing actually does what it needs to do by getting an attack in. Those are things that need to be considered, and Ruthless Raider kind of bypasses it all, because you get something when it comes down and you get value when it's killed, and it needs to be killed, because 4 power is not something you can ignore for very long before it does too much damage where you can't come back from. This is a great top end of the curve, alongside something like the Fett's Fire Spray that made Jango and Boba Fett so feared when they were in the meta. Of course, you still have the Boba Fett leader from set 4 that plays Ruthless Raider and Fett's Fire Spray oftentimes, and it's still a good card in there too. And finally, one of the most disruptive, most annoying cards to play against, No Good to Me Dead. This is something that initially, when I was starting to play Star Wars Unlimited, I wasn't 100% convinced by this card. And this was really because I had come from, Magic the Gathering and those types of trading card games where it was much more, I don't want to say discipline, but you had more options to interact with your opponent. So this ability to, okay, I temporarily remove a unit from being able to do stuff doesn't seem that great to me. But here's the thing. With Star Wars Unlimited's action economy, this back and forth, okay, I need to get to my action before I can actually attack with this unit, No Good to Be Dead becomes one of the most powerful events in the entire game. This 2 resource event locks down a unit for 2 rounds. It is incredibly powerful. You suddenly have an immediately readied up unit, boom, exhausted, can't get readied up next round, and that's oftentimes enough just to finish out a game. Usually those units are what's stabilizing you in more mid-rangey decks. You need those units to get down, kill opponents' units, and maybe get some attack triggers like Restore or whatever it is. This thing stops that. This is one of the events that contributed to, double yellow decks being so powerful, like the double yellow Boba, some of those decks that just completely ran through people. But also, even without like double yellow Boba, you're seeing like Boba, new set 4 Boba yellow, where you're just playing No Good to Be Dead as like a nice little value engine, because all you need is just a little bit more time before you get kind of overwhelmed by their more powerful cards potentially. This being so cheap as it is super powerful to disrupt your enemies. We saw Jango play it. We saw Boba Fett's play it. We saw basically any cunning villainy deck that's a little bit more tempo oriented play it. It is just so strong for just 2 resources to lock down a unit for 2 whole rounds. But that's the top 10 list, guys. If I left anything out, let me know. If there's an uncommon that you're like, dude, what are you talking about? This is definitely in the top 10 list. Please let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.